The Air Nomads didn't lose their families during the genocide. They gave them up long before it happened. That sentence feels wrong at first because we've been conditioned to see the Air Nomads as harmless, gentle, almost fragile people. The monks who laughed easily, the nuns who smiled, the culture that preached joy, freedom, and balance. In most retellings, they're framed as victims of a sudden external evil, a peaceful society erased by an unexpected act of brutality. But when you slow down and actually examine how the air nomads lived, a more uncomfortable truth emerges. They didn't just reject power, they didn't just reject wealth, they didn't just reject hierarchy, they rejected bloodlines entirely. Air nomad children were not raised by their parents. Newborns were separated almost immediately, handed over to monks or nuns, divided by gender, and raised communally inside the temples. No mothers, no fathers, no nuclear families, no inherited names that mattered. This wasn't a failure of compassion. It was a deliberate cultural decision rooted in their deepest beliefs about suffering, attachment, and identity. To the air nomads, the self was not something to strengthen, it was something to dissolve. Individual identity in their worldview was the source of imbalance. The more tightly you clung to who you were, where you came from, and who belonged to you, the more you suffered when those things inevitably changed or disappeared. Bloodlines, by their very nature, encourage detachment. A child that belongs to one parent more than another. A family that matters more than the rest of the world. A future that feels personal instead of shared. To an air nomad, that was dangerous. They believed love wasn't wrong, but exclusive love was. Loving everyone equally was enlightenment. Loving one person more than the rest was a weakness. And so they designed a society where those bonds never had the chance to fully form. Every child belonged to everyone. Every adult was responsible. Every bond was spread thin on purpose. In theory, this created equality. No favoritism, no inheritance, no child burdened with the expectations or failures of their parents. No parent tempted to break the rules for their own blood. In a peaceful world, it might even be considered ideal. But philosophies don't exist in isolation. They exist inside real worlds, with real consequences. By rejecting bloodlines, the air nomads also rejected legacy. They rejected inheritance not just of wealth, but of responsibility. They removed the idea that something specific needed to be protected at all costs. There was no family name to preserve, no lineage to defend, no descendants who carried your identity forward after death. The air nomads weren't trying to survive history. They were trying to transcend it. And that distinction matters more than anything else that comes after. Because survival requires selfishness. It requires prioritization. It requires deciding that this person matters more than that person. That this future is worth fighting for even if others are lost along the way. The air nomads deliberately trained those instincts out of themselves. They chose peace over preparedness. For centuries, the world rewarded that choice. The Avatar cycle maintained balance. Wars were limited. Power was restrained. The air nomads floated above conflict, literally and philosophically protected not by armies or bloodlines, but by the assumption that the world would remain stable. That assumption was their foundation, and assumptions are invisible until they break. The uncomfortable question isn't why the air nomads were wiped out. It's why they believed they never would be. Their culture was built on the idea that detachment was the highest virtue, that letting go was strength, that refusing to anchor yourself to the world was the only way to remain spiritually pure. But purity doesn't create continuity. It creates fragility. A structure that holds perfectly under calm conditions can collapse instantly under pressure. And the air nomads never built for pressure. When you remove bloodlines, you remove the instinct to protect children at all costs. When you remove inheritance, you remove the motivation to preserve something beyond your own lifetime. When you remove exclusive bonds, you remove the willingness to commit violence for something specific. Those things don't matter in peace. They matter when peace ends. And buried inside this philosophy is the tragedy of Aang, not just as the last airbender, but as the final outcome of a cultural experiment that assumed the world would never turn cruel enough to test it. Aang wasn't born into a broken culture. He He was born into one that had never been forced to confront what it would lose the moment violence stopped being optional. To understand why the air nomads rejected bloodlines, you have to understand what they were trying to protect themselves from. They weren't afraid of loss, they were afraid of clinging. In air nomad philosophy, suffering doesn't come from pain itself, it comes from the refusal to accept impermanence. Everything changes, everything ends. People leave, people die. The more tightly you grip any of it, the more it hurts when it slips through your fingers. This belief wasn't abstract to them. It was the foundation of how they structured every part of their lives. They watched the other nations organize themselves around permanence. Earth Kingdom families passed down land, names, titles. Fire Nation bloodlines passed down power, loyalty, and expectation. Water Tribe families centered survival around kinship and protection. Even when these structures created strength, they also created fear. Fear of losing what had been inherited. Fear of failing those who came before. Fear of being the weak link in a chain that stretched backward and forward through time. The air nomads looked at that and saw a trap. Bloodlines to them didn't just create love, they created obligation. An obligation made people predictable, possessive, and controllable. A ruler can threaten a family, an enemy can exploit lineage, a parent can be manipulated through a child. The air nomads believed the fastest way to free a person was to remove the leverage the world could hold over them. So they did it early. By separating children from parents at birth, they prevented the formation of bonds that could later be weaponized. A monk without a family could walk away from a conflict without hesitation. A nun without heirs couldn't be coerced through threats of loss. An airbender without descendants had nothing to pass down, and therefore nothing to defend at the expense of others. This wasn't naive, it was strategic. It created people who were almost impossible to control. And for centuries, that worked. Air nomads could move freely across borders. They could travel without suspicion. They weren't seen as political threats because they didn't seek to expand, conquer, or dominate. Their lack of bloodlines meant no dynasties, no rulers, no inherited authority. Power couldn't calcify in their society because it had nowhere to root itself. But there's a difference between being ungovernable and being undefended. The air nomads were so focused on preventing corruption that they also prevented consolidation. No family rose above the rest, but no family stood firm when pressure came either. Everyone was equal and equally expendable, like communal parenting reinforced this mindset from birth. A child didn't grow up hearing stories about who their parents were, what they had done, or what was expected of them. They grew up hearing teachings about the world as a whole. Their sense of identity was intentionally diffuse. They were taught to see themselves as part of a flowing system, not a fixed point within it. That kind of upbringing produces calm, adaptable people. It also produces people who struggle to form singular grounding attachments. We see this contradiction most clearly in the moments where air nomad philosophy quietly fails. Monkey Atso isn't supposed to favor Aang. He isn't supposed to bend rules for him, sneak him treats, or shield him from responsibility. Yet he does. Repeatedly. Not because he's careless, but because human connection refuses to be engineered away. Gyatso doesn't love Aang in the abstract. He loves him specifically. And that specificity is exactly what the air nomads tried to eliminate. This creates a tension at the heart of their culture. They preached detachment, but practiced affection. They rejected bloodlines, but still formed bonds. They claimed attachment caused suffering, yet couldn't live without it entirely. Instead of acknowledging that contradiction, they buried it under tradition and discipline. The problem wasn't that attachment existed, it was that it existed without acknowledgement, without structure, and without preparation for what happens when it's threatened. Bloodlines don't just create love, they teach people what they're willing to sacrifice for. A parent knows instinctively what lines they will cross to protect their child. A culture built around families understands loss in personal terms. It understands that sometimes ideals collapse under the weight of survival. The air nomads never allowed themselves to learn that lesson. They believed that if they could simply rise above those instincts, they could avoid the cycle of violence entirely. They chose moral consistency over adaptability. In a stable world, that choice looked enlightened. In an unstable one, it was catastrophic. Because when violence finally arrived, it didn't arrive as an idea to be debated. It arrived as an event to be survived. And survival demands clarity. It demands knowing what matters most, who comes first, and what you are willing to lose to protect what remains. The Air Nomads had deliberately trained themselves not to think that way. They had spent generations dismantling the very instincts that could have saved fragments of their people. This is where the rejection of bloodlines becomes more than a philosophical curiosity. It becomes a fatal flaw. By erasing lineage, the Air Nomads erased continuity. There was no plan for rebuilding after disaster, no fallback structure, no preserved memory passed down through families if institutions fell. Everything lived in the present moment beautiful, fleeting, and vulnerable. They believed enlightenment meant freedom from fear. But fear exists for a reason. Fear tells you when something is worth protecting. The Air Nomads didn't fail because they lacked wisdom. They failed because they trusted wisdom to protect them from a world that operates on force when ideals stop working. And Aang, raised inside this belief system, would eventually be asked to confront the exact moment where philosophy ends and reality begins. Aang was never taught how to hold on to anything. From the moment he could understand language, the lessons were consistent and quiet. Nothing is permanent, nothing belongs to you, and clinging only deepens suffering. The Air Nomads didn't teach this harshly. They taught it gently, through games, stories, and rituals that made impermanence feel natural rather than frightening. Let go of anger. Let go of fear. Let go of the idea that the world owes you stability. For most children raised in the temples, this worked. They weren't destined to carry the weight of history. They weren't asked to anchor the future. Their role was to move through the world lightly, leaving as little imprint as possible. But Aang was never going to be allowed that luxury. When the monks realized he was the Avatar, they didn't just uncover a truth about him. They activated the one contradiction Air Nomad philosophy was never designed to resolve. What happens when someone raised to let go is told that the world depends on them staying? The Avatar is a role built on continuity. It's a responsibility that stretches backward and forward through time. The Avatar inherits not just power, but expectation. The world doesn't ask the Avatar to detach, it asks them to commit, to choose sides, to intervene, to decide which suffering matters most when not all suffering can be prevented. That is the exact opposite of what Aang was trained to do. When the monks told Aang he was the Avatar early, they believed they were preparing him. In reality, they were destabilizing him. They took a child whose identity was already intentionally diffuse and added the heaviest, most singular identity imaginable. He went from belonging to everyone to belonging to the world, from being one of many to being irreplaceable. And they gave him no framework to process that shift. Aang wasn't afraid of responsibility in the abstract. He was afraid of what responsibility would take away from him. Becoming the Avatar meant separation. It meant leaving the only community he had ever known. It meant training far from the temples. It meant expectations he couldn't escape. And because he had never been taught to form exclusive bonds, he had no internal anchor to hold on to when everything else started to slip. So when Aang ran away, it wasn't defiance, it was muscle memory. Air Nomad detachment taught him that when attachment becomes painful, you step back. When identity becomes overwhelming, you release it. Letting go wasn't just encouraged, it was survival. Running was not a rejection of his culture, it was the most faithful expression of it. The tragedy is that Aang didn't understand the difference between letting go and abandoning himself. When he emerges from the iceberg 100 years later, the cost of that misunderstanding becomes unbearable. The Air Nomads are gone, not scattered, not hiding, erased, and because there were no bloodlines, no families, no descendants outside the temples, there's nothing left to reconnect with. No one waiting, no shared grief, no communal rebuilding. Aang doesn't just lose his people, he loses the possibility of return. Survivor's guilt usually comes from the feeling that you lived while others died. Aang's guilt is deeper. He believes his existence is the reason the Air Nomads don't exist anymore. Not because he caused the genocide directly, but because he wasn't there to stand in the way of it. And unlike other cultures, there is no bloodline to absorb that loss collectively. All of it collapses inward onto him. The Air Nomads believed removing bloodlines would remove inherited guilt and expectation. What they didn't anticipate was what happens when one person becomes the sole carrier of an entire civilization's memory. Aang doesn't inherit stories from parents or grandparents. He inherits extinction. Every Air Nomad teaching he remembers becomes evidence against himself. Every lesson about detachment feels like a personal failure. If he had let go sooner, would the pain hurt less? If he had stayed, would anything have changed? The philosophy gives him no answer that brings peace, only more questions that spiral inward. And this is where Aang's arc begins to diverge from what the Air Nomads intended. He wants to honor them. He wants to live by their values. But those values were never designed to operate inside a world that demands accountability. Detachment works when you are choosing it freely. It collapses when detachment becomes the only thing standing between you and unbearable responsibility. Aang doesn't resist being the Avatar because he doesn't care about the world. He resists because becoming the Avatar means accepting that letting go didn't save anyone. And that realization fractures him. The Air Nomads taught Aang how to release his grip on the world. They never taught him how to stay when everything he loved was already gone. And so he drifts between joy and grief, between childhood and leadership, between a philosophy that no longer fits and a role he isn't ready to inhabit. By the time the war reaches its end, Aang isn't just deciding how to stop Ozai. He's deciding whether the values that raised him still deserve to survive. The Air Nomads never prepared for war because war, to them, was a failure of the world itself. Violence wasn't just something to be avoided, it was something that only existed when people clung too tightly to power, territory, or identity. In their view, conflict wasn't inevitable, it was optional, a symptom of attachment gone wrong. And because of that belief, they structured their entire society around the assumption that if they lived correctly, violence would never fully arrive at their doorstep. That assumption is what doomed them. The Air Nomads didn't build armies. They didn't fortify temples. They didn't create defensive hierarchies or emergency structures meant to preserve the next generation at all costs. They didn't train children to fight for their people or their future. Instead, they trained them to float above conflict, to evade, redirect, and escape rather than confront. In a world where violence is sporadic, this works. In a world where violence becomes systemic, it fails catastrophically. The Fire Nation didn't attack the Air Nomads out of chaos or impulse. It was calculated, coordinated, and generational. A society built on bloodlines, inheritance, and loyalty moved against a society that rejected all three. Fire Nation soldiers were raised knowing who they were, where they came from, and what they were expected to defend. They carried names, honor, and obligation into battle. Their identity was sharpened into something that could survive pressure. The Air Nomads had done the opposite. When the attack came, there was no instinct to regroup around families because families didn't exist. There was no instinct to prioritize children over elders because children belonged to everyone and no one. There was no plan to preserve lineage because lineage was considered spiritually irrelevant. What the Air Nomads had cultivated instead was a collective instinct to disperse to escape individually rather than defend collectively. This is the quiet horror of their extinction. They weren't wiped out because they were weak benders. They weren't wiped out because they lacked intelligence or skill. They were wiped out because their philosophy left them without a framework for resistance. Detachment stripped them of the urgency that allows people to endure unimaginable loss in order to protect something specific. Violence doesn't care about purity. It doesn't ask whether your ideals are consistent. It doesn't pause to debate whether survival contradicts enlightenment. It simply advances. And when it does, cultures that refuse to anchor themselves to blood, land, or future generations are the first to vanish. The Fire Nation understood something the Air Nomads refused to accept. That peace is not a permanent state. It is something enforced, defended, and preserved through continuity. Through parents who raise children to continue what they started. Through stories passed down not as philosophy, but as warning. The Air Nomads believed the cycle of violence could be escaped by refusing to participate in it at all. But refusing to participate doesn't stop the cycle. It only ensures you won't survive it. What makes this even more tragic is that the air nomads were not naive about power. They understood bending deeply. They understood the Avatar's role. They understood balance. What they underestimated was human nature under pressure. They assumed that if they lived without attachment, others would eventually follow. Instead, others exploited it. The genocide wasn't just an act of overwhelming force. It was the collision of two incompatible worldviews. One believed identity must be inherited and defended. The other believed identity must be dissolved and released. When those philosophies met, only one could survive. And this realization reframes Aang's story entirely. Aang doesn't inherit a broken world simply because the Fire Nation won. He inherits a world where one entire approach to existence has been proven unsustainable under violence. The Air Nomads didn't lose because they lacked righteousness. They lost because righteousness alone does not stop people who are willing to burn the future to secure their own. This is why the weight on Aang is unbearable. He isn't just being asked to end a war. He's being asked to decide whether his people's philosophy can exist in a world that has already rejected it. Every choice he makes forces him to confront the same question the Air Nomads never answered. What happens when letting go is no longer enough? The Fire Nation answered that question with conquest. The Air Nomads never answered it at all. And standing between those two failures is a 12-year-old who has to decide whether survival requires becoming something his culture never prepared him to be. By the time Aang stands in front of Ozai, the war is already over in every way that matters. The Fire Nation has won culturally. The Air Nomads are gone. The Water Tribes are fractured. The Earth Kingdom has been hollowed out from the inside. Even if Ozai falls, nothing truly goes back to how it was. Aang isn't fighting to restore the past. He's fighting to decide what survives into the future. This is the moment where Air Nomad philosophy should collapse entirely. Every practical argument points in one direction. Ozai is too dangerous to leave alive. Killing him would end the war decisively. Every past avatar agrees on this. Even Aang understands it. On an intellectual level, the world is asking him to make a clean, efficient choice, one that prioritizes stability over principle. But the thing the world doesn't understand is that this isn't just about Ozai. If Aang kills him, the Air Nomads disappear for a second time. Not physically, philosophically. Up until this point, the Air Nomads have already paid the ultimate price for their beliefs. Their refusal to form bloodlines left no descendants. Their refusal to prepare for violence left no survivors. All that remains of them is Aang's memory and his choices. If he abandons their core value, the belief that life should not be taken to secure order, then nothing of their culture endures at all. The genocide becomes total. This is the impossible bind Aang is trapped in. He is not choosing between mercy and justice. He is choosing between relevance and extinction, between adapting fully to a violent world or insisting that at least one philosophy remains untouched by it. The irony is cruel. The Air Nomads rejected bloodlines because they believed ideals mattered more than inheritance. And now Aang must decide whether ideals can survive without any inheritance at all. Energy bending is not a convenient answer. It is not a loophole. It is an act of desperation. It represents Aang reaching backward, beyond institutions and traditions, to something older than the divisions between nations. Something that predates war, empire, and bloodline entirely. Energy bending allows him to end the conflict without reinforcing the logic that created it. No execution, no martyrdom, no lineage erased to preserve another. In that moment, Aang does what the Air Nomads never did. He adapts. The Air Nomads believed detachment meant refusing to change under pressure. Aang redefines detachment as refusing to surrender your values, even if the structure that once supported them is gone. He doesn't preserve their society, he preserves their ethics stripped of the assumptions that made it fragile. But that choice creates a new problem, because ending the war without bloodshed doesn't teach the world how to move forward. It only teaches them that the Avatar found a way out this time. The Air Nomads had no plan for governance, no blueprint for reconstruction, no answer to what happens after enlightenment. Their philosophy ends at personal purity, not collective responsibility. Aang feels that absence immediately. After the war, he struggles. He struggles to lead. He struggles to balance cultures that don't share his values. He struggles most of all with family because rebuilding the Air Nomads requires doing the one thing they refuse to do. He has children. This is not a small deviation. It is a complete reversal. Aang forms a bloodline not because he has abandoned his culture, but because he understands something they never allowed themselves to confront. Ideals that cannot be passed down do not survive. Detachment can inspire, but it cannot endure on its own. Without inheritance, without continuity, philosophy evaporates the moment the person holding it disappears. Tenzin is not a contradiction of Air Nomad values. He is their correction. Through Tenzin, Aang anchors what was once unanchored. He accepts attachment not as a weakness, but as a necessary cost of survival. The Air Nomads believed attachment corrupted purity. Aang learns that refusing attachment erases the future entirely. This is the quiet tragedy beneath his victory. Aang saves the world without killing. He preserves his people's beliefs without preserving their structure. But in doing so, he becomes something the Air Nomads never planned for: a reformer. Someone who must decide which parts of a philosophy survive contact with reality and which parts must be left behind. The Air Nomads rejected Bloodlines because they believed enlightenment required letting go of the future. Aang proves that enlightenment without continuity is just another form of disappearance. The Air Nomads didn't just disappear from the world, they left behind a wound that never properly healed. Because once they were gone, the Avatar cycle lost something it had always relied on without ever naming it: a culture that existed outside inheritance, outside conquest, outside legacy. A people who did not measure success by what they passed down, but by what they released. They were the only nation that didn't try to shape the future in its own image. And once that counterweight vanished, the entire system tilted. Aang spends the rest of his life reacting to that imbalance. Every choice he makes after the war carries the quiet knowledge that something fundamental is missing. The world doesn't just need peace, it needs continuity. It needs memory. It needs institutions that can survive long enough to correct themselves. And the Air Nomads never built those because they believed the highest form of wisdom was freedom from time itself. That belief does not survive history. When Korra enters the cycle, she inherits the consequences of Aang's adaptations. She grows up in a world where peace is enforced, not assumed, where balance is fragile and temporary, where ideals have to be defended rather than trusted to endure. And she pays the price for that reality directly physically, spiritually, and psychologically. Korra restores what Aang could not: the Air Nation. But she does it by breaking the Avatar's connection to the past entirely. In restoring one continuity, she destroys another. This isn't a failure of character. It's the cycle responding to unresolved tension. Each Avatar repairs what the last one lost, and in doing so, sacrifices something else. That pattern traces all the way back to the Air Nomads' original choice. They believed detachment would protect them from suffering. Instead, it deferred suffering into the future, concentrating it onto fewer and fewer individuals. First onto Aang, then onto Korra, and eventually onto whoever comes next. Because the world still hasn't resolved the question the Air Nomads refuse to answer: how do you preserve peace in a world that does not stay peaceful? Detachment alone cannot do it. Attachment alone cannot do it either. The Earth Avatar will inherit a world that understands this more clearly than any before it. A world that has seen pacifism fail and domination fail. A world that has learned repeatedly that extremes collapse under pressure. What they will be asked to do isn't to let go or to cling tighter, but to remember without becoming trapped by what came before. This is the lesson buried beneath the Air Nomads' tragedy. They were not wrong to reject bloodlines. Bloodlines do create hierarchy. They do create violence. They do create cycles of expectation that crush individuality and fuel conflict. The Air Nomads saw that clearly long before anyone else did. But they mistook insight for immunity. They believed that seeing the danger was enough to escape it, that understanding attachment meant they could erase its consequences entirely. What they didn't account for was that attachment doesn't only create suffering, it also creates responsibility. And responsibility is what carries a culture forward when ideals alone are no longer enough. A culture that refuses inheritance refuses memory. A culture that refuses memory cannot recover from collapse. The Air Nomads were right about freedom. They were right about compassion. They were right about the danger of clinging to power and identity. They were wrong about time. Peace is not a permanent condition. It is a fragile state that must be rebuilt, retaught, and recommitted to by every generation. Without bloodlines, without continuity, without people who feel personally responsible for what comes next, peace dissolves the moment the world turns hostile. Aang understood this too late to save his people, but not too late to change the future. He compromises where they refuse to. He anchors where they floated. He accepts attachment not as enlightenment's enemy, but as its cost. And that is the quiet truth at the center of the Air Nomads story. They didn't disappear because they were weak. They disappeared because they trusted the world to remain gentle forever. It didn't. And the legacy they leave behind isn't a warning against pacifism, it's a warning against believing that ideals alone can outlive the conditions that make them possible. The Air Nomads were meant to be lived, not preserved. Once the world changed, they had no way to change with it. And that is why their loss still shapes every avatar who follows not as a failure to be corrected, but as a lesson that can never be forgotten.